Krypton was, at its peak, one of the most technologically advanced civilizations in the known DC Extended Universe. Through its mastery of science, Krypton was able to spread throughout the stars and create multiple colonial settlements and outposts. For a period of almost 100,000 years, Krypton as a society flourished. Krypton's society was almost entirely genetically manipulated for centuries. Each Kryptonian was bred for a specific and sole purpose in a specialized artificial incubation birthing facility known as the Genesis Chamber. Unfortunately, due to a self-inflicted geological cataclysm, Krypton was destroyed, but it lived on in the form of a database of the collective genetic material of the Kryptonian species known as the Kryptonian Growth Codex. Today's video is going to cover the Kryptonian birthing facility known as the Genesis Chamber, as well as the repository of all remaining Kryptonian genetic information known as the Growth Codex. Now, before we begin, the topics we're discussing in today's video are that of the Chamber and Codex within the DCEU films. For the purposes of this video, we will not be discussing any similar items from the comics. As with our other lore videos, it's important to make this distinction because the DCEU is not the main prime DC universe that comic book readers know. The DCEU takes creative liberties with a lot of the source material, so just keep that in mind as we continue. As mentioned before, Kryptonians are a race of genetically engineered humanoid beings. Kryptonians are not made through traditional reproductive means, if you know what I mean, I guess. Instead, their species is artificially incubated using a combination of genetic manipulation, artificial incubation, and birthing, although, as mentioned previously, it wasn't always this way. The process begins with the Kryptonian Growth Codex, a repository of ancient Kryptonian genes that acts as a database for genetic bloodlines of Krypton and attributes to be applied to Kryptonian embryos, or sometimes referred to as seeds, for the purposes of selective breeding. This codex, when combined with Kryptonian technology, would allow their society to manipulate the type of Kryptonians born, and the attributes that any Kryptonian would have. Think of the codex as a cookbook that contained all of the ingredients needed to make whatever type of offspring you wanted or needed at that time. With these genetic blueprints, you could dictate exactly what types of beings inhabit your world and outposts. Do you need scientists to advance your species? How about warriors to defend it? Generals to command those warriors? Laborers? Scholars? Artists? Anything a flourishing society would need is all contained within the Codex. This is how all of Kryptonians were created for thousands upon thousands of years, and it's the direct reason why Kryptonians were able to expand throughout the galaxy. Once you've chosen the desired attributes, the embryo is imprinted and incubated in what was called the Kryptonian Genesis Chamber. The main Genesis Chamber was an underwater facility that housed these embryos or seeds for the purposes of protection and monitoring. The Genesis Chamber was a highly restricted area, and entering the facility was strictly forbidden. No one was allowed into the facility for the risk of tampering with offspring or harming or stealing the Codex. In fact, during the events of Man of Steel, we learned that it's a Class B crime. Presumably B is behind A, so I guess it's pretty serious. I have no context, but I just thought that was interesting. The Genesis Chamber is made up of thousands of incubating Kryptonian fetuses, monitored by aquatic robots, all growing so that they could be born and assigned their lifelong place in society. It's important to note that the Genesis Chamber on Krypton was massive. However, smaller versions of these chambers were also aboard scout ships and on outposts. These facilities were used to breed the exact types of beings needed for each new world and outpost that Krypton inhabited, and that's kinda how it was for thousands upon thousands of years. Eventually, the planet Krypton became incredibly unstable as a result of mining within the planet's core. One of the planet's foremost scientific advisors and the leader of the Kryptonian Thinker Guild, Jor-El, learns of the planet's impending doom. Understanding that the planet is going to be destroyed, Jor-El races into action and begs the Kryptonian Law Council to give him the Growth Codex for the purposes of reviving long-abandoned Kryptonian outposts that house Genesis Chambers and seeds. This would, in effect, allow Krypton to live on after the planet was destroyed. However, before the Council could accept or reject Jor-El's advice, lifelong friend and leader of the Warrior Guild, General Zod, attempted a military coup to unseat the Council. Zod also wanted the Codex for the purposes of what he believed would be a restorative measure, attempting to purge weaker bloodlines from the race to establish order and help restore their dying planet, somehow. However, the planet was set to blow, and without waiting for permission, Jor-El entered the main Genesis Chamber in the capital city of Kandor and retrieved the Growth Codex. The Codex was then brought back to Jor-El's home and imprinted into the genetic DNA of his son, Kal-El, the first naturally born Kryptonian in centuries. Zod arrived at Jor-El's home and demanded the Codex, but Jor-El tells Zod that it's now safely stored within his infant son. After getting absolutely thrashed by Jor-El in combat, Zod cowardly kills Jor-El in a last-ditch temper tantrum. Jor-El's wife blasts their infant son and the Codex into space in a rocket, and Zod attempts to disable and retrieve the ship, but is promptly arrested and brought to justice by the Kryptonian Law Council, where he is banished to the Phantom Zone. Shortly thereafter, the entire planet of Krypton is destroyed. Kal-El arrives on Earth and is raised as an Earthling, without the knowledge of his home planet or the Codex that's contained within him. Years later, Jor-El and Lara's son, Kal, has grown into adulthood on the planet Earth and now goes by the name Clark Kent. He's grown to be incredibly strong and with fantastic powers due to the radiation of the yellow sun that Earth orbits. Clark questions his abilities and comes to find a Kryptonian outpost ship, and within it is an artificial consciousness of his father Jor-El, who informs him of the events that have transpired as well as his own origin. Zod and his warriors arrive on Earth after breaking out of the Phantom Zone and demand that the people of Earth turn Kal over to him. Zod plans to use the Codex housed within Kal-El and the Genesis Chamber on the Lost Scout ship to establish Krypton on Earth using Kryptonian terraforming world engines, which would kill off the majority, if not all, of human life on Earth. After a massively destructive battle between the two Kryptonians, who are relatively inexperienced fighting on Earth with their newfound and tremendous abilities, Kal eventually defeats Zod by breaking his neck. Everybody then lives happily ever after. Except they don't. See, Zod's body is recovered by the government and eventually comes to be in possession of Lex Luthor. After identifying that the radioactive remnants of Krypton allowed Zod's body to be significantly weakened and examined, Lex Luthor cuts off Zod's fingerprints with a kryptonite blade and uses them to access the Genesis Chamber on the crashed scout ship. Lex finds the remnants of the Kryptonian archives and learns of the Kryptonian race and the usage of the Genesis Chamber and Codex. He combines the deceased body of General Zod and his own biological DNA into the Genesis Chamber and commands it to create a new being from that material. The process is deemed illegal by the ship, citing the Kryptonian Law Council's decree, but Lex overrides the refusal due to the fact that they're all dead. The resulting being created is a monstrous deformity known as Doomsday. Clark, now going by the name Superman, as well as Batman and Wonder Woman, are eventually able to defeat Doomsday, unfortunately at the cost of Superman's life. After the death of Superman, as the invasion of Earth by Steppenwolf's forces begins in Justice League, the newly formed Justice League team comes to realize that if they're going to have any chances of defeating Steppenwolf, they need Superman's help. The Justice League attempts to resurrect Clark using a Genesis Chamber on the Kryptonian scout ship, as well as a Mother Box, a creation engine from Steppenwolf's birth planet that's capable of also seeding life due to the perpetual energy matrix within it. However, when Lex created Doomsday, he fried the circuitry in the scout ship's Genesis Chamber. So to create the necessary power, Flash runs and creates a massive electrical current that wakes the Mother Box. The energy within the Mother Box, combined with the Genesis Chamber fluid, creates a massive electrical reaction that resurrects Superman. And that is basically everything that we know about the Kryptonian Growth Codex and the Genesis Chamber within the DCEU right now. I hope you guys learned a lot about the Genesis Chamber and the Codex, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe, and drop a comment down below. It really helps us out, all the typical YouTuber stuff we ask you to do. This has been Nick from Key Issues, thanking you again for watching, and remember the motto, Krypton over everything.